The last time anyone saw Ethan and Caleb Carroway, it was a humid July afternoon in 1997. The two brothers, dressed in their neatly pressed Boy Scout uniforms, were laughing as they cut across the gravel road leading toward the tree line of Ironwood Forest. Ethan, 14, walked ahead with a quiet confidence, the kind of protective instinct that came naturally to an older brother. Caleb, 11, followed close behind, his backpack bouncing against his shoulders, his energy as boundless as the summer air around him. The storm had been building all day. Thick clouds rolling in from the west, the scent of rain clinging to the wind like an omen. By the time the boys disappeared beneath the canopy of Ironwood, the sky had already darkened, thunder grumbling low against the horizon. Neighbors would later recall watching them vanish into the trees, assuming they were headed toward the familiar cave system scouts often used as a makeshift shelter during their adventures. But when the storm unleashed its fury, sheets of rain, bolts of lightning splitting the sky, the Carroway brothers never returned. At first, it seemed a tragic but straightforward story. Two boys caught in a violent summer storm, perhaps swept into one of the flooded ravines or crushed beneath a fallen tree. The official search stretched on for days. More than 100 volunteers combed the forest, their voices echoing to the tangled pines. Helicopters scoured from above, their spotlights cutting ghostly circles into the mist. Dogs caught faint scents that led nowhere, fading like whispers in rain. For the Carroway family, each day ended with false hope. Margaret Carroway, their mother, stood by the tree-line each evening, clutching her son's photographs as if holding them tighter might somehow pull the boys back home. Daniel Carroway, their father, joined the search himself, trudging through the mud until his legs nearly gave out, refusing to surrender to the possibility that his sons had vanished without a trace. When the storm finally cleared, so did the urgency of the search. Officials quietly began to shift their narrative. The brothers, they said, had likely drowned or succumbed to exposure. The forest was vast, dangerous, and unforgiving. Sometimes nature swallowed lives whole, leaving nothing behind but questions. It was an explanation that satisfied no one. Not the family, not the scouts who knew Ethan's skill with knots and Caleb's boundless curiosity, and not Sheriff Walter Briggs, who led the initial investigation. Briggs had walked those woods his entire life, and something about the disappearance unsettled him in ways he couldn't shake. There were small details, uncomfortable details, that never fit the narrative of two boys simply lost to the storm. Searchers had discovered a piece of rope tied carefully around a tree root near the entrance of the cave the boys often explored. The knot was intricate, unmistakably Ethan's handiwork, the kind of thing he proudly showed off at scout meetings. But the rope led nowhere. It hung like a breadcrumb without a trail, a signal that seemed almost staged. Still, with no bodies, no evidence of foul play, and pressure mounting to bring closure, the official record closed quietly. The Carroway brothers were mourned as victims of nature, their names added to a long, unyielding list of tragedies tied to Ironwood Forest. But beneath the soil, the truth lay hidden. It would remain buried for 11 years, until the summer of 2008, when a logging crew contracted by Ironwood Aggregate and Supply began clearing a new section of the forest. One morning, as the sun broke through the canopy and chainsaws buzzed in the distance, a machine operator brought his equipment down hard against the earth. The impact didn't hit stone or root or earth. It struck metal. The sound was unmistakable, an echoing clang that rang through the trees, halting the worksite. When the crew scraped back the soil, they uncovered the edge of a rusting steel surface. At first, they thought it might be an abandoned septic tank or some forgotten equipment left behind by quarry operations. But as the dirt was cleared, the true shape emerged, a shipping container buried deep beneath the forest floor. Authorities were called immediately. Sheriff Briggs, now grayer and wearier but still in uniform, arrived on scene with a pit in his stomach. He remembered the Carroway boys. He remembered their mother's face when the search was called off. And as he stood over the unearthed container, he felt a sickening certainty that this was connected. When FBI investigators arrived, the container was carefully cut open. What they found inside stopped every heart on scene. 2 worn mattresses, a battery-powered CD player, its surface coated in dust, stacks of comic books, their pages yellowed, food wrappers scattered in the corners. And along the walls, scratch marks etched into the metal. It wasn't just a container. It was a prison. The discovery rewrote everything the town thought they knew about the Carroway brothers' disappearance. They hadn't been lost to the storm. They hadn't drowned in some ravine. They had been taken, hidden in plain sight, just beneath the ground they had searched so desperately. The question that haunted investigators now was not just who had built such a place, but why. The mystery of Ironwood Forest was no longer about two boys swallowed by nature's fury. It was about a predator who had moved unseen among them, orchestrating something far darker than anyone had ever imagined. And this time, the truth would not stay buried. The news of the shipping container spread through the town like a contagion. Within hours, the discovery had transformed from a quiet logging site disruption into a full-blown crime scene swarmed with vehicles, yellow tape, and flashing lights. Reporters camped along the gravel access road, their voices hushed, as they too felt the weight of what lay beneath Ironwood soil. For the Carroway family, the phone call came just after noon. Margaret answered. She listened without speaking, her hand pressed to her mouth as the sheriff's voice delivered the words she had long feared yet secretly hoped for. "We've found something. We think it's connected to Ethan and Caleb." Daniel drove them both to the site. They arrived in silence, passing the familiar tree line that had once swallowed their sons. When Margaret saw the container, its steel side scarred with rust and clawed by desperate fingernails, her knees buckled. Daniel caught her before she hit the ground. To them, it wasn't just evidence. It was a coffin without bodies, a cruel reminder that their children's final moments had been lived in a cage. The FBI took control quickly. Special Agent Dana Mercer, a woman whose reputation was built on chasing ghosts of unsolved crimes, stepped into the lead. Her sharp eyes missed nothing. Not the scratches on the wall, not the piles of comic books, not the length of rope discarded in the corner. She whispered something to her partner, Dr. Alan Keats, a behavioral analyst whose job was to translate horror into human motive. He bent low, studying the etched marks, counting them one by one, as if the boy's suffering might spell out a message in code. The community's reaction was volatile. For over a decade, people had lived with the belief that the Carroway brothers had been nature's victims. That belief had softened the edges of grief. Now it was gone. In its place came anger, suspicion, and fear. If someone had built a prison in Ironwood Forest, it meant the predator hadn't come from the shadows of nature. He had come from among them. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some whisper about strangers seen near the forest in the late 90s. Others pointed fingers at locals who lived alone, reclusive men whose habits were suddenly re-examined under a harsher light. Sheriff Briggs, though officially sidelined by the FBI, kept his ear close to the ground. He knew this town, and he knew that fear, once unleashed, always found a target. The first target was Franklin Frank Harlow, the foreman at Ironwood Aggregate and Supply. He had worked at the quarry for decades, a man with a reputation for hard drinking and a temper that flared faster than dry pine. Harlow was no stranger to law enforcement. Bar fights and disorderly conduct littered his record. He also knew Ironwood's terrain as well as anyone, where the roads cut deepest, where heavy machinery could move without drawing attention. It was enough to make him a suspect. Witnesses stepped forward, too eager, too certain. One remembered Harlow arguing with Ethan at a gas station just weeks before the disappearance. Another claimed he'd seen Harlow near the forest on the day the boys vanished. None of it was solid, but in a town desperate for answers, it was enough to ignite suspicion. The FBI brought him in for questioning. Under the sterile glow of the interview room, Frank looked every bit the part of a man guilty of something. Sweat rolling down his neck, hands twitching, eyes darting at questions he didn't like. But guilt, Mercer knew, didn't always belong to the guilty. Sometimes it was simply the posture of men unaccustomed to scrutiny. Still, his words raised flags. Asked about the summer of '97, Frank admitted he was working a night shift at the quarry, hauling gravel from a remote site. He couldn't recall every detail, couldn't remember who else had been with him. He laughed nervously, as though the questions were absurd, but the sound rang hollow. Behind the glass, Dr. Keats scribbled notes. "He's hiding something," he murmured, "but it may not be what we think." The search of Frank's property turned up little. A cluttered shed, rusting tools, half-empty bottles of whiskey, old hunting gear. But no shipping containers, no evidence of abduction, no trace of the Carroway brothers. And yet, suspicion clung to him like sap. Margaret Carroway herself couldn't look at him without shaking. In her eyes, Frank had already taken her children. In the eyes of the town, he had become the human shape to their nightmare. But Agent Mercer wasn't convinced. Something about the container, the careful preparation, the small touches meant to keep children alive but captive, spoke of precision, of planning. That wasn't Frank Harlow. He was chaotic, violent, but sloppy. Whoever had done this wasn't sloppy. He was meticulous. As the FBI widened their net, the container was transported for forensic analysis. Technicians swabbed every surface, bagged every scrap of refuse, every comic book, every faded wrapper. The hope was that somewhere, hidden in the rust and filth, was a fingerprint or a hair that would finally give Ethan and Caleb's prison a name. But until that evidence surfaced, the town lived under a cloud of suspicion. Parents kept their children close. Locks were changed. Gun safes were opened. The illusion of safety had been shattered, and once gone, it could not be pieced back together. Sheriff Briggs drove home each night with the container's image burned into his mind. He thought of Ethan's rope skills, of Caleb's soft laughter, of the forest trails that once promised adventure but now promised only grief. And as he poured himself a drink he didn't need, he wondered, not for the first time, whether the monster they were hunting was closer than anyone dared to admit. The container was more than evidence. It was a portrait, one carved not with paint, but with deprivation, desperation, and control. Dr. Alan Keats stood alone inside the evidence warehouse where it now sat, its steel walls casting back the echo of his footsteps. He ran a hand across the gouges in the metal, his mind turning each scratch into data. These weren't random marks. Some were high, some low, some shallow, others deep. To him, they told a story of two boys, one older, taller, scratching with strength that waned over time. Another, smaller, testing seams near the base. He could almost see Ethan's hand press against the wall. Caleb crouched beside him, whispering a plan that would never work. Keats closed his eyes. He'd built profiles from less. Half a fingerprint, the angle of a discarded shoe, the way a body had been left in the woods. But here, in this steel coffin, the abductor had left a blueprint of his mind. Whoever did this wasn't impulsive. Keats told Mercer later that evening, as they stood over case files spread across a motel desk. He didn't grab them in the heat of anger. He prepared. He built this. Mercer leaned against the dresser, arms folded. Her dark hair was tied back, her face set in that practiced calm. She wore like armor. "You're saying this wasn't Frank Harlow?" "I'm saying," Keats replied carefully, "that Harlow couldn't have done this. This took planning, weeks at least, engineering, power hookups, airflow, insulation. It's crude, but it's functional. Whoever built it thought about how to keep children alive down here, not kill them outright." He tapped the file. "That isn't Harlow. He can barely keep his job at the quarry sober." Mercer nodded slowly. She had felt it too, that tug in her gut telling her Frank was a dead end. But gut wasn't enough. Not here. Not with the whole town ready to put Harlow's head on a spike. "We need someone with technical knowledge," Keats continued. "Someone who works with HVAC, ventilation, maybe construction. Someone meticulous enough to build a prison in secret, but ordinary enough to pass under the radar." Mercer considered this. The forest was ringed by small towns, each filled with blue-collar tradesmen. Contractors, welders, electricians. Any one of them could have been the architect. But one detail nagged her, the location. The container wasn't dumped randomly. It was buried deep in Ironwood, close enough to the quarry roads that heavy machinery could conceal the operation. Whoever did this had access. She looked back at the list of employees connected to Ironwood Aggregate and Supply in the late 90s. Dozens of names. Some still local, some long gone. One stood out, not for his record, but for his silence. Malcolm Dreyer. Dreyer had worked for a subcontractor servicing the quarry's HVAC systems. He wasn't a loud presence like Frank Harlow. He had no bar fights, no criminal history. No one remembered much about him at all. He'd been described as quiet, methodical, always fixing vents and ductwork in the background. And then, around 1998, he'd left the company, moved 2 towns over, started his own small repair business. Dreyer, Mercer said aloud, circling the name. Keats looked over her shoulder. He fits. Too neatly, Mercer countered. But we'll check him. In the following days, Mercer and her team traced Dreyer's movements. His work history showed a pattern. Long hours, odd jobs in remote places, clients who remembered him only vaguely. He left little behind. No family, no close friends, no digital trail worth following. But when Mercer obtained a warrant to dig into his business receipts, something surfaced. In the summer of 1997, Dreyer had purchased a surplus shipping container from a salvage yard, paid in cash. The record was almost invisible, buried in handwritten invoices. But it was there. Mercer felt her pulse quicken as she set the paper down. Still, suspicion wasn't evidence. Without forensics from the container, without DNA, without a direct tie to the boys, it was another loose thread in a tangle of theories. And in the meantime, Frank Harlow continued to bear the brunt of community outrage. Protesters picketed his trailer. His truck was vandalized. Someone spray-painted Monster across his shed. Sheriff Briggs watched it unfold with growing unease. He wasn't a man given to mercy, but he knew mob justice when he saw it. And he knew how dangerous it was when the real monster was still out there, unseen, untouched. One evening, as the sun sank over Ironwood's treetops, Briggs visited Margaret and Daniel Carroway. He sat at their kitchen table, hat in his hands, listening as Margaret's grief curdled into fury. "Why didn't you find us sooner?" she demanded. Her voice was raw, years of silent mourning erupting at once. "Why did my boys sit in that box while you told us it was a storm?" Briggs had no answer, none that would soothe her, none that would bring Ethan and Caleb home. He only promised her the truth, and as he left the house, his eyes fell on the forest, dark and impenetrable in the distance. He wondered if the man who had built that prison still walked those trees, blending with the ordinary, hiding in plain sight. Because if Mercer was right, Ironwood hadn't just swallowed 2 boys. It had concealed a predator clever enough to outweight them all. In the daylight, Malcolm Dreyer was forgettable. That was his strength. He fixed air conditioners, unclogged vents, replaced rusted ductwork in basements that smelled of mildew and regret. Homeowners remembered him, if at all, as the man who barely spoke, who finished his job quickly, who left no trace behind except cool air flowing where there had been none. His van, a faded white box truck with peeling letters, Dreyer Cooling and Repair, was always parked neatly at the edge of driveways. Inside, tools were arranged with almost surgical precision. Wrenches in size order, coils of tubing tied tight, electrical tape stacked like ammunition. To anyone peeking inside, it was a workspace of a man obsessed with control. Neighbors said he kept to himself. The lawn was always mowed, the curtains always drawn. Children cut across his yard without fear, though their parents pulled them back with muttered warnings they couldn't explain. Dreyer didn't drink in bars, didn't attend church, didn't linger at town gatherings. He existed like a shadow moving along the edges of Ironwood's towns, tolerated because he was useful. What they didn't see were the notebooks. Hundreds of pages spiral-bound, filled with sketches of vents, containers, underground chambers. Diagrams that began as HVAC schematics but gradually warped into something else. Plans for captivity, airflow to sustain human lungs, notes on temperature regulation to prevent death by heat or cold, scribbled equations for how long it would take carbon dioxide to accumulate inside a sealed box. The container in Ironwood Forest had been the culmination of those notes. But it was not his only attempt. In a storage unit 2 towns over, Mercer's team would one day find crude mock-ups, small seal crates, ventilation ducts bolted on, filters replaced again and again, as though he'd been testing how long someone could survive inside. The unit smelled of rust and oil and something faintly metallic, like blood long scrubbed away. For now, though, Dreyer moved freely. The FBI's interest had not yet reached his doorstep. It began with quiet surveillance. Mercer and Keats set up a rolling observation. Unmarked cars parked along streets. Agents blending into diners with cheap coffee and folded newspapers. Dreyer's patterns were maddeningly normal. He woke at 6. He worked until dusk. He bought groceries, never more than he needed for one. He went home. The lights went out by 10. But Keats was not fooled. "This is discipline," he said as he and Mercer watched Dreyer's van pull into another driveway. "The same discipline it took to build that container. He thrives on routine. He hides in it." Mercer frowned. "Routine doesn't put him at the scene." "No," Keats admitted, "but it tells us who he is. He's not chaotic. He's not Harlow. He's careful. He's patient. He waited for those boys." That night, Mercer made the call. Dreyer would be brought in for questioning. The interview room at the sheriff's office smelled faintly of coffee and dust. Dreyer sat across from Mercer, his hands folded neatly, his posture composed. He wore a press work shirt with his name embroidered in red script. He looked like what he was supposed to be, an ordinary tradesman. "Mr. Dreyer," Mercer began, sliding a file onto the table, "we're looking into the disappearance of Ethan and Caleb Carroway. You were working at Ironwood Aggregate around that time. Do you remember?" Dreyer tilted his head slightly, as though the name were a faint echo. "The Carroway boys," he said softly. "Yes, I remember when they went missing. Tragic." "Tragic," Mercer repeated, watching his face. "And you were working maintenance at Ironwood in 97? "Off and on," Dreyer replied. His voice was calm, steady, each word measured. "I wasn't there full time. Just HVAC work when they called me." Mercer opened the file, showing the salvage receipt. "We also found records of you purchasing a shipping container that summer." For the first time, Dreyer blinked. Not much, but Keats, seated behind glass, caught it. "I did," Dreyer admitted. "I was planning a storage project. Never worked out. Left it behind when I moved." Mercer leaned forward, her tone still even. "Where exactly did you leave it?" Dreyer's lips curved into something like a smile. "It was 20 years ago, Agent Mercer. Do you expect me to remember every scrap of metal I touched?" Mercer studied him, silence stretching like a wire pulled taut. He met her gaze without flinching, the faintest trace of amusement in his eyes. When the interview ended, Dreyer walked out into night, free, his van pulling away with the same precision as always. But Mercer felt the unease in her chest sharpen into certainty. He was their man. She could feel in the way he measured every word, in the satisfaction behind that smile. He had looked at her not like a suspect confronted with evidence, but like a predator indulging in a game. And somewhere inside Ironwood Forest, she feared that game wasn't finished. Monsters rarely announce themselves. They don't appear in dark cloaks with snarling faces. Often, they are quiet men who fix things, men who wave politely but never linger. Men like Malcolm Dreyer. He was born on the edges of Ironwood, raised in a house where silence was a rule and punishment came without warning. His father worked quarries until his back gave out, his temper sharpened by cheap whiskey. His mother, brittle and exhausted, kept her head down. For Malcolm, childhood was a place of locked doors and whispers in the dark. Neighbors remembered him as the boy who spent hours alone in the woods, building crude shelters from fallen branches, digging pits, fashioning rope snares that never caught more than squirrels. He was fascinated by spaces hidden from sight, by the idea of creating rooms where no one could see or hear. His teachers noticed his knack for technical work, ventilation, circuitry, problem solving, but they also noticed his lack of empathy. When other children cried, Malcolm watched with detached curiosity, as though observing an experiment. By his teenage years, Dreyer's obsession had matured into something darker. He sketched diagrams of underground shelters in his notebooks, annotated with notes about airflow and insulation. When most boys were dreaming of cars or girls, Malcolm was drawing cages. After high school, he apprenticed in heating and cooling systems, the perfect cover for his fixation. He learned how to move air invisibly, how to hide ductwork, how to regulate temperature in sealed rooms. He became skilled, respected even, though never liked. Clients praised his efficiency, but few ever felt comfortable around him. It was during his contracting work at Ironwood Aggregate and Supply that Dreyer first saw the land that would haunt the town forever. The company's lease gave him access to machinery, to remote tracts of forest no one else visited. The roar of excavators and crushers masked any sound he needed to hide. To him, it was perfect. Investigators would later piece together scraps of his movements during the mid-1990s. Receipts for steel ventilation tubing, bulk orders of filters, rental logs for excavators that coincided with weekends when no one else was scheduled. All the signs were there, buried in paperwork no one thought to connect until years later. And then there were the children. Martin Hale, the scoutmaster, had his suspicions long before the bunker was found. He remembered the way Dreyer lingered near the scout meetings, offering to help with the heating system in the church basement. The boys didn't like him. Ethan Carroway once whispered his mother that the air guy stared too long, his gaze heavy, assessing, but nothing ever crossed a line enough for a report. Dreyer was careful. He was always careful. Careful enough that when Ethan and Caleb vanished, no one looked at him. The storm was the culprit. The floodwaters the villain. Dreyer receded into background, a man who fixed ducks and disappeared into the woods. But as Keats sifted through his history, in 2008, a pattern emerged. He's been rehearsing for decades, Keats told Mercer, laying out a timeline of receipts and sketches. Every job, every piece of equipment, training, preparing. The container wasn't impulsive. It was the pinnacle of his life's work. Mercer looked over the photographs again. The rusted hatch, the mattresses, the pendant. She thought of Margaret Carroway, her hands trembling as she clutched her son's photograph in the sheriff's office, begging for closure. And then she thought of Dreyer, his calm voice in the interview room, the way he had smiled as though holding back a secret. For years, the Carroway family believed Ethan and Caleb had been swallowed by the storm. But Mercer now saw the truth with a clarity that chilled her. The storm had not taken them. It had hidden them, and Dreyer had been waiting in the shadows of Ironwood Forest all along. Predators like Malcolm Dreyer believed they could erase themselves. No fingerprints, no DNA, no witnesses. Just silence. But even silence leaves shadows, receipts, records, fragments of memory that cling stubbornly to the world long after the act is done. Special Agent Dana Mercer built her case on those shadows. At FBI headquarters, the conference room walls were now lined with photographs and timelines. Dreyer's quiet life dissected piece by piece. Each pushpin marked a date. Each string connected a receipt, a signature, a gap in his alibi. It looked like chaos to the untrained eye. But to Mercer, a picture was forming. The shipping container was a cornerstone. Dreyer had purchased it in cash through a salvage broker in the summer of 1997. That broker, tracked down after weeks of digging, remembered the transaction. Funny guy, he told Mercer. Didn't haggle. Didn't ask about delivery. Just wanted to know if it was watertight. Most buyers care about rust. He cared about seals. Then came the ventilation tubing. Records showed Dreyer had ordered several hundred feet from a supplier in Cedar Bluff, a town 2 hours south. The invoice was dated exactly 1 week before Ethan and Caleb Carroway vanished. Ventilation and containment, Keats muttered as he circled the invoice and read. It's not cooling systems anymore. He was building a prison. Witness statements began to resurface, too. A former quarry hand named Ray Lubbock, now retired, recalled seeing Dreyer parked at the Ironwood aggregate site late at night in the summer of '97. Thought it was strange, he told Mercer. Guys like him, contractors, they don't stick around after hours. But his van was there. Lights in the woods, like he was running a generator. Bit by bit, the threads tightened. Still, Dreyer's mask held. He continued to run his business, taking jobs, smiling politely to customers who would never guess the man adjusting their thermostat might be the same one who sealed 2 boys into darkness. When Mercer pulled his bank records, she found no anomalies, no sudden wealth, no large transfers. Just a steady hum of man who earned, spent little, and saved obsessively. But Keats saw through the illusion. He doesn't need money to feel rich, he said during a late-night strategy session. His currency is control. Every duct, every latch, every lock. It feeds him. That container wasn't about ransom or gain. It was about power. He built a world where only his rules mattered. The problem was convincing a jury. Suspicion was not proof. Receipts were circumstantial. A sighting from more than a decade earlier could be dismantled on a stand. Mercer needed more. The break came from a place she least expected. While combing through salvage yard records, an intern flagged a detail Mercer had overlooked. The container's original manufacturer had stamped a unique serial number on its frame. That number matched the one found beneath the rust on the Ironwood container's door, corroded, almost erased, but still legible under forensic light. And next to that number, etched faintly into the metal with what looked like a workman's scribe, were initials. M.D. Mercer stared at the photograph, her pulse quickening. Dreyer's arrogance had finally betrayed him. He had signed his work. When she showed the photo to Keats, he didn't smile. He only whispered, "This isn't evidence of pride. This is ownership." He wanted the world to know, if it was ever found, that it was his. That night, Mercer drove past Dreyer's house. The curtains were drawn, the lights off. His van sat in the driveway, spotless, its tools neatly arranged inside. From the street, it looked like any other home in Ironwood. But Mercer knew now what lurked beneath that ordinary shell. The storm had not taken the Carroway brothers. The storm had covered his tracks. And now, piece by piece, she was uncovering them. The second time Malcolm Dryer was brought in, it was no longer a polite conversation. The interview room was colder now, stripped of small talk, stripped of patience. Mercer slid the photograph across the table. The close-up of the shipping container's corroded steel frame, the faint initials etched into the metal. M.D. Dryer studied it, his face unreadable. His fingers brushed the edge of the photo, lingering just a fraction too long. "You recognize that?" Mercer asked. "No," he said simply. "Looks like rust scratches. Scratches that match your initials." Dryer tilted his head, offering the same mild smile as before. "Coincidence." From behind the glass, Keats leaned forward, muttering, "He's savoring this." Mercer pressed on. "You purchased that container in the summer of 1997. We have the broker's statement. We have the receipts for the ventilation tubing. And now we have your mark carved into steel. You want to explain that, Mr. Dryer?" His eyes flicked up, sharp now, just for an instant. "You think marks on metal prove anything? I've worked on hundreds of containers, thousands of ducks. If you scrape long enough, you'll find all kinds of letters." Mercer leaned closer, her voice low and deliberate. "You carve your signature into a tomb." The room stilled. Dryer's smile faltered, barely, but it was enough. Outside, Keats whispered, "There, that's the crack." Mercer let the silence stretch, a tactic she perfected over years of interrogations. People rushed to fill silence, but Dryer didn't. He sat perfectly still, breathing evenly, his gaze fixed on her as though they were the only two people in the world. Finally, he spoke. "You don't have bodies. You don't have witnesses. You don't have anything but mud and rust." His words cut, but Mercer didn't flinch. She thought of Margaret Carroway, her hands trembling as she pressed her son's photograph against her chest in the sheriff's office, whispering, "Don't let them be forgotten." "You're right," Mercer said softly. "We don't have bodies, but we have a mother who never buried her sons. And we have your work. The kind of work no storm could hide forever." For the first time, Dryer's jaw tightened. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Keats saw it. "He hates when you call it work," Keats noted quietly. It was more than that to him. It was his creation. Mercer sat back, folded her arms. "So tell me, Malcolm, what happens when we start tearing apart the rest of Ironwood Forest? When every inch of soil is turned over, do you think we'll find more of your work?" The smile vanished completely. His eyes narrowed, and for the briefest moment Mercer saw it. The predator behind the mask, the flicker of anger, of control slipping. Then he leaned back, composed again. "Dig wherever you like, Agent Mercer. The forest is vast. People get lost. Accidents happen. Storms come and go. You'll never prove a thing." He stood when they released him, walking calmly out of the station, as though the conversation had been nothing more than a business meeting. But Mercer knew better. He was rattled now, and rattled men made mistakes. That night, Daniel Carroway sat at his kitchen table, staring at the photo of Ethan and Caleb in their scout uniforms. Margaret moved quietly around the room, her grief worn into her body like weight she could no longer set down. "They have him," Daniel whispered. "I know they do." Margaret didn't answer. She simply placed her hand on the photograph, covering their sons' faces with trembling fingers. In Ironwood Forest, the storm had hidden a monster. Now Mercer intended to drag him into the light. The morning after Malcolm Dreyer walked out of station, the FBI set a quiet perimeter around his world. No flashing lights, no sirens, just shadows and unmarked cars and eyes hidden behind newspapers. Dreyer was a creature of habit. Each day he left his weather-beaten house at dawn, his utility truck rumbling to life with a cough of diesel. He drove the same route into town, stopped at the same corner store for black coffee, then vanished into warehouses and basements where air moved through ducts no one else could reach. Mercer and her team charted it all. Every stop, every purchase, every person he nodded to without a word. He was a ghost moving through a world that never noticed him. But the investigators noticed everything. Inside his truck bed, beneath tarps and coiled tubing, they spotted tools heavy enough to dig into soil, cut through steel, or hide secrets no one wanted unearthed. His invoices told another story. Jobs near Ironwood Forest, maintenance calls in remote substations, small contract with Ironwood aggregate and supply that stretched back decades. Every scrap of his paper trail placed him on the edges of where Ethan and Caleb vanished. Mercer kept the photographs of the container schematics on her desk. Every line, every measurement bore Dreyer's mind. This wasn't improvisation. This was engineering. She told Keats one night over takeout cartons. This wasn't the work of someone caught in the moment. This was devotion. Keats nodded. He wasn't hiding boys. He was building a stage for his fantasy. Meanwhile, the Carroway household sagged under the weight of new headlines. A neighbor slipped a newspaper under their door. The words "prime suspect" blared above Dreyer's grainy booking photo. Margaret refused to look at it. Daniel stared until his eyes burned. "I should have gone with them that day," he whispered. His voice cracked in the silence of their kitchen. "I should have." "Daniel." Margaret cut him off, though her own voice trembled. Don't go there. We'll drown if we keep going there." But neither could stop. The years had eaten away at their marriage, their health, their sleep. Now, with Dreyer's name in the air, the past clawed back into the present with fury neither could contain. Mercer knew time was running thin. Surveillance could build patterns, but patterns weren't proof. They needed something concrete, an object, a witness, a slip in Dreyer's control. That slip came one evening in late autumn. An agent tailing him through the outskirts of Ironwood reported Dreyer pulling his truck onto an unmarked dirt road leading deep into the forest. He parked, got out, and disappeared into the trees with a flashlight and a canvas satchel. "Stay back," Mercer ordered through the radio. "We don't spook him yet." The agents watched from the ridge as his beam cut across the undergrowth, pausing at certain clearings, circling trees as if measuring them against memory. After nearly 2 hours, Dreyer returned, mud streaked up to his knees, his satchel visibly heavier. He drove off into the night, without looking back. When the team searched the area later under the cover of darkness, they found disturbed earth in several places, shallow dig sites, each abandoned quickly. Nothing human. No remains. Just test holes, as though Dreyer had been looking for something he himself had forgotten. Mercer crouched in the dirt, her hand brushing the soil. He's revisiting, reliving. The question is, what exactly did he leave behind? Keats, standing beside her, answered grimly. Or who? That night, Mercer went home but didn't sleep. Her wall of photographs loomed over her desk. Ethan and Caleb smiling in uniforms, Dreyer's flat stare at his mugshot, the steel container yawning from the forest floor. She scribbled the same line into her notebook 3 times, her pen digging into the paper. Control always slips. The question is when. The warrant was signed just after dawn. By 7 o'clock, unmarked cars rolled onto Merrill Lane, tires crunching over frost-stiff gravel. Malcolm Dreyer's weather-stained bungalow sat hunched beneath sagging pines, its windows shuttered like the eyes of a man who never wanted to be seen. Mercer stood at the front of the line, vest heavy on her chest, hand poised in the chill air. Go. The team surged forward, splintering the door in a single strike. The smell hit first, metal, mildew, and something sweet rotting just beneath it. Dryer wasn't inside. The house was silent, but it was a kind of silence that pressed against the eardrums, holding its breath with them. Every wall was layered with dust, but not neglect. Calculated control. Tools hung in perfect alignment on the garage wall. Ducts, coils of tubing, and ventilation diagrams were stacked in binders labeled in Dryer's neat script. But it was the basement that stopped them cold. Concrete stairs led down into a room that felt too clean for the decay above. A workbench stretched the length of the far wall. Above it, pinned with yellowing tacks, were sketches of containers. Some crude pencil drafts, others precise engineering blueprints. Arrows marked airflow systems, reinforced corners, lock mechanisms. Keats whispered. He refined it over years. Beside the workbench stood a metal cabinet. Mercer forced it open. Inside lay rows of binders, each marked with years. 1996, 1997, 1998. Her hands trembled as she pulled one free. Inside, receipts, supply orders, notes written in careful block letters. One page bore chilling lines scrawled in red ink. They never stop breathing if you build it right. The team worked methodically, documenting every scrap, every screw, every sketch. But Mercer's eyes fixed on a smaller box at the bottom of the cabinet. She opened it slowly. Inside lay tokens. A broken watch strap, a rusted scalp pin, a red cord tied in a neat knot. Ethan's watch. Caleb's pendant. The room went still. Mercer swallowed hard, forcing her voice steady. Bag everything. Back in town, Daniel and Margaret Carroway sat stiffly on their worn couch as Sheriff Briggs delivered the news. He spoke carefully, but the words landed like blows. We found items that belonged to your boys. In Dryer's possession. Margaret clutched Daniel's hand, her knuckles white. Her voice broke on a whisper. So he had them? Briggs looked down. Yes. There's no doubt now. Daniel's jaw tightened, his grief hardening into something darker. Then don't tell me you just found trinkets. Tell me you'll put him where he belongs. But Dry was still out there. By nightfall, the manhunt stretched across Ironwood Forest. Helicopters scouring tree lines, agents sweeping through ravines and quarry edges. Dryer had vanished like smoke, leaving only the echo of his twisted architecture behind. At FBI command, Mercer stared at the evidence laid out on long folding tables, the pendants, the sketches, the binders. Each item whispered of years of planning, of lives stolen and reduced to souvenirs. Keats stepped beside her. We've crossed the threshold, Dana. This isn't about suspicion anymore. This is his signature, his scripture. Mercer nodded, though her face was set like stone. And scripture has followers. If he built one tomb, maybe he built others. The night stretched long. Margaret and Daniel lay awake in their separate silences. The weight of proof, both a relief and a new torment. Their sons had not been swallowed by storm or chance. They had been taken, intentionally, cruelly, and now the predator who had held them was loose in the very woods where it began. The hunt stretched into its third day. Ironwood Forest groaned under the weight of search teams, dogs baying against the wind, the thrum of helicopters rattling through the canopy. But Malcolm Dryer remained a ghost, his knowledge of the back roads and cut trails unmatched. He had vanished before. This time he carried the weight of exposure on his shoulders, and desperation made him dangerous. Mercer refused to rest. She stood over a topographical map, tracing her finger along old service roads. He's not just running. He's circling. He knows this forest too well to disappear without leaving a trace. Sheriff Briggs leaned in, voice low. Unless he's got another hole in the ground. The thought turned her stomach. By afternoon, a break came. A hunter stumbled into a clearing deep in the northern ridge. What he thought was an abandoned hunting blind. Inside, agents found something far darker. A hatch, camouflaged with brush, bolted into the earth. The soil smelled of oil and rust. Beneath it lay a tunnel, freshly disturbed. Mercer's team descended carefully, weapons drawn. The air was damp, metallic. The tunnel sloped into a chamber lined with plywood and insulation. At its center stood another container, smaller, unfinished. Inside were stacked crates of supplies, canned food, water jugs, blankets, and taped to the wall, yellowing Polaroids. Mercer's breath caught. The photos showed two boys, Ethan and Caleb Carroway, alive inside the first container. Ethan's face hard with defiance, Caleb softer, wide-eyed, clutching his brother's arm. Each picture marked with dates spanning months, then years. And then Mercer froze. The later photos showed only Caleb. Alone, his hair longer, his face thinner, but unmistakably him. The date stretched as late as 2003, 6 years after the boys vanished. Her voice cracked in the stillness. "Oh my God!" Caleb survived. Keats stared at the sequence, horror etched across his face. This means Dreyer lied. He didn't let him go in 2001. He kept him. For years. The revelation rippled through the team like a shockwave. Mercer's hand shook as she pulled the last Polaroid free. Caleb was older now, maybe 15, his eyes hollow, but alive. The date scribbled beneath was 2003. That was the last image. After that, nothing. Before the team could process, a crack of branches above sent dust raining down. Dreyer. A shout rang through the forest as agents above closed in. Dreyer burst from the tree leaner than they remembered, eyes wild, a pistol clutched in his hand. Shots split the air. Agents dove for cover. Mercer sprinted from the hatch, shouting, "Dreyer, drop it." He turned, sneer twisting his face. "You don't understand. Caleb was mine. He chose to stay. You'll never find him." The words chilled Mercer to her core. Chose to stay? Was it manipulation, delusion, or was Caleb somehow still out there? The standoff stretched taut as wire. Helicopter blades thundered overhead. Dreyer's finger whitened on the trigger. Briggs flanked wide, voice booming. "It's over, Dreyer. Drop the gun." But Dreyer's laugh was ragged, broken. "You think this ends with me?" His eyes darted toward the forest beyond, to a shadowed ravine that disappeared into the trees. Then, in one swift motion, Dreyer turned the gun on himself. A single shot cracked. His body collapsed into the ferns, the echo carrying through the valley. Agents rushed forward, but Mercer stood rooted, her gaze fixed on that ravine. His final words gnawed at her. "You'll never find him." Back at command, the Polaroids were laid out under harsh fluorescent light. Margaret Carroway's sobs echoed down the hallway as she pressed her trembling fingers against Caleb's face, captured in those grainy photos years after she thought him gone. Daniel, rigid beside her, whispered, "If he lived that long, then maybe—" Mercer's voice was soft, almost unwilling to break the fragile hope. "Maybe he's still alive. Or maybe Dreyer passed him to someone else." The possibility turned everyone cold. Forensic teams scoured Dreyer's property, tearing apart his home, his workshop, every inch of the forest surrounding it. But in a hidden compartment beneath the floorboard of his garage, they uncovered something that rewrote everything. A map. It wasn't a simple sketch. It was detailed, coded, routes through Ironwood and beyond. Not one container site. 3. Each marked with dates spanning more than a decade. The room went silent. Mercer whispered the words none of them want to believe. He wasn't building one prison. He was building a network. The implication was staggering. Caleb may not have been Dreyer's only captive. And worse, he may not have been the last. As the agents traded haunted looks, Briggs stepped forward, jaw clenched. Then the real question isn't just what happened to Caleb. Mercer finished the thought, her eyes fixed on the map's final mark, a site dated just 5 years earlier. The question is, who's in there now? The map's ink seemed to bleed under the harsh light, its final coordinates pointing to another hollow of Ironwood Forest still untouched. The night pressed heavy against the windows of the command post. Somewhere in that vast, unyielding forest, answers waited, but so did more secrets. The story was far from over.